Well, thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. We are live tonight from Algiers Point, a neighborhood in New Orleans that's just across the Mississippi River, the wide, wide river from the French Quarter and downtown New Orleans. One of the things that is nice about this neighborhood is the great view that it gives you of the city's downtown. But I've always thought that Algiers itself and Algiers Point were pretty beautiful in their own right. Renting a house in this neighborhood, if they're on average for the city right now, cost you about 40% more than it would have before Hurricane Katrina and the catastrophic flooding that followed the storm when the levees broke. This neighborhood, though Algiers Point, did not flood. They had some wind damage. They went through a hurricane, after all, but the water didn't rise here. And yet this is still an American neighborhood that is surviving Katrina in some ways, still surviving. We're here for a couple of days to see what surviving Katrina still looks like here in this great place, here in New Orleans. The original name for where I'm standing right now was the Calliope Housing Projects. Looks like Calliope, but if you're in New Orleans, sounds like Calliope. And it then became the B.W. Cooper Public Housing Projects, and that's where I'm standing right now. It should be noted that it's really not the B.W. Cooper Housing Projects anymore. It's not anything anymore. B.W. Cooper, along with 3 other huge housing projects in New Orleans, a couple of years ago got torn down, leveled. Not necessarily because they were storm damaged. A lot of them really weren't. A lot of them were very solid construction and didn't have much damage at all. But the city voted in 2007, City Council voted in 2007 to tear them down, and in 2008, down they came. The New Orleans City Council voted to demolish the public housing in 2007. In 2008, the demolition happened. More than 3,000 apartments, many of them totally undamaged by the storm and the flooding. Many of them occupied. They were torn down. Now, it's not like the projects were Shangri-La. They were dangerous. And I talked with folks today who had lived in the projects before the storm and who thought that the best thing to do was to tear them down. But it was housing. It was housing for poor people who couldn't otherwise afford to live in this city. The idea was to use the storm as a pretext to not just tear down those big bad housing projects, but to replace them with mixed-use housing. So woefully poor people wouldn't be concentrated in big giant blocks. Some of that replacement building is complete. Some, well, see for yourself. That's B.W. Cooper. Here's a site where the rebuilding is well underway. This is where it used to be the St. Bernard Public Housing Project. And from where I'm standing right here, you can actually get a pretty good shot of the before and the after, even though some of the before is still now. This is what the housing units here essentially used to look like. This is some of the original structure. Across the street here, actually, if you just pan over here with me, you can see this is some of the new development. You can see how different it is. This is intended to be mixed income housing. It's not intended to be all subsidized, income dependent public housing. So they tore down 963 public housing units here. The new development, at least so far, is about 465, so significantly fewer. But in terms of what's still available here, in terms of really public, heavily subsidized housing like this all used to be here, it's only about 150 units. See, the math on this doesn't work. If you take housing that's set aside just for poor people, even if you hate that housing, if you take away the all poor people housing and replace it even one for one with new units that are mixed, some totally market rate, some with little subsidies, some with full subsidies, if you replace even bad public housing with equal numbers, let alone smaller numbers of mixed use housing, then at the end of the day, ultimately you have just dramatically reduced the amount of housing in this city that poor people can afford to live in. Maybe the housing that they do get will be nicer, but there just aren't going to be as many poor people around anymore. About 70% of all the occupied housing in the city sustained some kind of damage when the levees broke in 2005. A majority of that was rental housing. Quite a lot of it has been rebuilt, but there's a waiting list of 28,000 families for affordable housing in New Orleans right now. It's not that every apartment, every house in New Orleans is occupied now. They're not. There is a vacancy rate. It's not that there is a housing shortage per se. It is a shortage of housing that poor people can afford to live in. And so you have a city that has regained 80% of its pre-storm population, but it is not the same population. African Americans and the poor are underrepresented among the people who have been able to come back. And for people who can come back, things are tough. In Orleans Parish and St. Bernard Parish, only 60 or 70% of the schools from before the storm have reopened. Crime is bad. It was bad before. It's bad now. The 23 hospitals that were here in Orleans Parish are now 12 hospitals instead. If you want mental health services because, I don't know, say you survived an apocalypse and had to flee for your life, the biggest mental health unit in the city of New Orleans, since the ones in the hospitals closed, the biggest mental health unit in the city is now in the prison. Being back here again, it is a beautiful city. Algiers Point is beautiful. Rebuilding is beautiful. Strength under adversity is beautiful. When the Saints won the Super Bowl and everybody said New Orleans is back, none of us were kidding. But 5 years after the floods, even in the parts of the city that stayed dry, what's going on here is that we are still in this part of America. We Americans here are still surviving this. Joining us now is James Perry, who heads up the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. Fair disclosure, he's also the partner of MSNBC contributor Melissa Harris-Lacewell, though we would have wanted to talk to him regardless tonight. He also this year ran for mayor of this great city. Mr. Perry, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's the way I characterize the difficulty of moving back here. First of all, I get anything wrong? And second of all, how much harder is it to be poor in this city than it was before?
No, you got it absolutely right. It's the truth is that people who are here because they really want to be here, because it's difficult to be here, frankly. What we've seen is a net decrease in affordable housing in the city. And so for anyone who makes median income or below, it's a real struggle to find anything affordable. Now, there's lots of construction happening, but it's simply not construction of affordable housing.
Well, was that by design? I mean, when you look at the debate about tearing down the public housing projects, I understand that was a spirited debate, and I think there were, patriotic and honest arguments on both sides of that, certainly because so many of those projects were troubled. But then you look at the plans to rebuild and to have so many fewer units available to the people who qualified income-wise for those projects. Why?
Rachel, it was by design. You'll remember that the Bush administration was in charge at that time. And the Bush administration philosophy on subsidizing public housing was that the cost to government was too high. And so they were looking for a goal that would allow them to reduce the actual amount that taxpayers had to pay to subsidize housing. And so the idea was that by lessening the number of units in the city, they could achieve that goal. So they put great pressure on the city council here in the city of New Orleans to force them to go along with this plan that really didn't serve our low-income citizens well.
So how do you fight back? I mean, I have to say I've never thought of myself as somebody who really understood the nitty-gritty of housing policy, but coming back here, and everybody that I talk to, when you're talking about pre-Katrina New Orleans versus post-Katrina New Orleans, seems like that's just the spine that runs right down the middle of it. How do you fight it?
So here's the thing. I love my president. I think that President Obama does a great job, but he's done a great job with the new programs here. But the president has been reticent to fix the failures of the Bush administration. And so there are a few categories in housing where we need President Obama's HUD to come in and actually change what President Bush did here.
Change the whole orientation to the issue for the country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it can work because the president has a very different view on public and subsidized housing from President Bush. And so it can happen. But they have to be willing to be aggressive and to change the way that things have been done here.
When people think about making it affordable for poor people to live in cities, what we think about is the old school housing projects, the old school thinking about that sort of thing. What's the way to make New Orleans a place where everybody who lived here before can come back that doesn't go back to the troubled housing projects that we saw?
Sure. Well, there's some basic premises that have to exist when you build new housing. And so the first one is that there has to be one-for-one replacement, not of the total number of units, but of the total number of affordable units, right? Yeah. And so it means that you have to build more units than existed before in order to achieve that goal and still have mixed income. But you have to have that principle. The second is that you have to use something called this whole process where instead of moving everyone else at one time, you do it in phases. It's phased redevelopment so that you make sure that people don't end up homeless or lost in the process. We have doubled the number of homeless people in the city of New Orleans that we had before Hurricane Katrina. Wow. In 2005, 6,000 homeless. Now there are 12,000 homeless people in the city. And it's because they didn't use the right process.
To see the amount of services in the city decline. I talked with a woman today who had lived in Lafitte projects, and which have been torn down and they're being rebuilt, and she's hoping to be able to move back there. But meanwhile, she's got a voucher and she's got got paying rent in a neighborhood that she says is incredibly dangerous. Her neighbor's house was just shot at. There's been murders on her block. She was trying to get into one of the other redevelopment projects, and of course all of the affordable units are full. She was invited to apply to join the waiting list. One of the things that struck me, though, she said she was making about $15,000 before the storm. She's now making about $8,000. Meanwhile, though, she's had to buy a car, and bus service is gone in New Orleans. So being poor, it's not just harder to be here and pay rent. All of the things that people who aren't rich enough to take care of everything for themselves have to rely on, those are gone too. Hospitals, bus service, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's, you know, again, the people here are extremely resilient, right? And so they're here because they're fighting to be here. And so folks aren't asking for a handout from government, but just a help up, right? And that's all that folks are saying. And the Section 8 voucher program is a program that, frankly, has not worked here simply because it hasn't made it possible for people to move into neighborhoods that provide opportunity. And part of the reason is that there are so few neighborhoods with opportunity post-Katrina.
I don't know what the word is to describe somebody who is a patriot to a city. Booster isn't right, but patriot means country, but whatever that word is, you're that. James Perry, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
James Perry is the executive director of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center.